Airplanes, more than any other development, have changed the face of war in the 20th century. Among aviation experts, pilots, and enthusiasts, there has long been a spirited debate as to which aircraft, be it a bomber, fighter, or attack craft, is the very best of all time. Join us as we look at superior planes in each aircraft category and finally settle all bets during Air Power Showdown. Fighters. Fighters. Comparatively simple, small, and quick aircraft designed mainly for one purpose: to gain and hold control of the sky over a war zone. They first took to the skies in battle during World War I, with continuing refinements ever since. The battle commanders want air superiority, and fighters can give it to them. The force that controls the air will less likely suffer air attack on its own ground forces and installations, and in turn, with air superiority over the enemy's territory, an attack, whether on the ground or from the air, is all the more sure. But air superiority has never come easily. For as one fighter gains refinements that make it better in the dogfight, the next model from the opposing air force will likely match or better that performance. Ultimately, given pilots of similar skills and weapons of comparable capability, the airplane that outturns, outtwists, outshoots, and outruns the competition will likely take control of the skies. Today, however, fighters have to outturn, outtwist, outshoot, and outrun another kind of enemy, the missile, whether fired from the ground or from another airplane that may be miles out of sight, or from even beyond the expected battle area. Even so, the basic mission of the fighter going into the 21st century is not too much different from that of the fighters that first battled over Europe during World War I. A pilot, a high-performance, highly maneuverable airplane, and the best weapons available to blast adversaries from the sky.
We sometimes forget that enemy bombs have not fallen on American soldiers' heads for 50 years. And that's because of the great air superiority fighters that this nation has produced.
We're going to take a look at fighters from World War I to today, focusing on those that have been picked as the top airplanes in each of 6 eras by a worldwide panel of experts assembled by the editors of Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine. A panel of 25 historians, combat flying veterans, commanders, test pilots, and fighter designers. Also, a CompuServe forum offered the public the opportunity to vote. By the end of this program, you'll find out which one was selected as the best fighter ever. But first, how do you judge a fighter? Just what criteria do the experts use to evaluate the qualities of a fighting aircraft? Perhaps most important for fighters is their maneuverability, often referred to as transient performance by the airplane designers. This feature blends the airplane's ability to dive dramatically, climb powerfully, the kind of climb an F-15 has with full afterburner power.
You know, there's nothing more fun than doing an afterburner climb and standing around her tail and just watching, you know, the F-15 become a Saturn V for a few seconds.
Turn sharply. For example, the F-16 is among the top fighters in a tight turn.
All things being equal, if you fly the airplane properly, I'm going to be able to turn with anybody better than most, in fact, better than just about any airplane I've ever faced. And in the right hands, I'm going to be pointing at him first.
And how does maneuverability translate into an air combat win?
If you went into a diving, high-speed, high-G turn, the MiG couldn't keep up with you in that kind of a turn. So there were some tactics like that that let you pit one airplane against another to your advantage if you knew what you were doing.
Visibility is another key element. Even with radar and with airborne control airplanes aiding the fighters, the fighter pilot often relies on what he sees to win the dogfight. It's this kind of unobstructed visibility that can give a pilot the edge. F-16 pilots commonly say they feel they're riding on an airplane rather than in one. Range is a critical factor. The ability to carry enough fuel to get from a safe base or carrier into the battle and have enough fuel to fight and get home again. Survivability is another key element.
It would sustain a tremendous amount of battle damage and come home. I never knew of a Phantom that blew up in the air. When they would catch fire, they would burn, and normally we could possibly fly to try to get to a safe area before bailing out.
The firepower aboard can make all the difference. Whether it's the early improvement in machine guns on the World War I biplanes and triplanes, the 650 calibers on the P-51, or the multiple missiles available for use on the F-15.
I can shoot and destroy the enemy aircraft prior to him ever seeing me. So right there I have a definite advantage.
If you have the better weapons and more of them, you have a better chance in battle. Ceiling, the maximum altitude at which the fighter can effectively operate, is another measure.
To win a battle, air battle, you have to have maneuverability, acceleration, and usually altitude. And we always try to have altitude.
A fighter's speed assists in moving it to or out of the fray. And wartime kill rates are the ultimate win or lose measure of effectiveness against the adversary. So these are the considerations that go into building a fighter. A complex set of decisions and trade-offs involving cost, size, weight, and complexity, and shaped by anticipated needs and technical capacities at the time of design. But it boils down to two words: combat effectiveness. Does the fighter have what it takes to give its pilot the ability to kill and not be killed?
You use whatever, save your bleep. It's very difficult to tell you that. Now, if I've just been bounced, if he's coming in at me and I didn't see him approaching, I'm in deep, deep trouble. And your main idea there is not to be a dead hero, but a live pilot for the next day. So you do everything in your power to avoid getting killed.
But there is something more, too, an intangible factor. And that's the strength and depth of feeling that pilots have for their fighters. Today's fighter pilot duels in a complex assembly of metal, electronics, and thrust, with guns and missiles ready at the fingertips. The pilots and those who see and hear the airplanes and the battle reports develop a strong visceral reaction for the fighters that work. Let's look at the top fighters in each era and the airplanes voted best within their group. The first era of fighting airplanes encompasses 1910 to 1925. Practical airplanes had first been proven only a few years before this era began. But with World War I, the airplane flew into battle, and young, creative designers went to work. They developed types and uses of airplanes that hadn't been imagined, from adept and quick fighters to lumbering multi-engine bombers. And factories sprung up to build airplanes in huge volume. The nominees for top fighters are the Nieuport 17, a light and agile French fighter flown by some of the most famous Allied aces of World War I, the Fokker DR-1 triplane, the airplane of choice for the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. It was highly maneuverable, but also highly unstable. The Sopwith Camel, Britain's most famous World War I fighter, named for the hump that housed twin Vickers machine guns in front of the pilot. The Spad, among the fastest and most rugged of the war, U.S. Army Air Service pilots, including top U.S. ace Eddie Rickenbacker, preferred it over all other types. And the Fokker D7. The D stood for doppeldecker, 2 wings. It had no wire bracing in the wings, and with low drag and high strength, it could be pushed hard in combat. And the winner, the Fokker D-7. Powerful, rugged, maneuverable, and easy to fly, it was a fighter pilot's dream. The German pilots identified closely with their new airplane, which first saw combat in the last year of the war. Each pilot added his own insignia to maintain some sense of individuality in a war of mass slaughter. Peter Gross is a leading World War I historian who specializes in German aviation.
Yeah, the Fokker D-7 was probably the best plane of World War I. And I would say that the primary reason is that almost anybody could fly it without special instruction. Two-seater pilots could easily get into that cockpit and with just a little bit of transition instruction, fly it. Now the second thing, he felt safe in that airplane. It was almost stall-proof. It had the great big thick Fokker wing like you see here, so that it could almost stand on its tail attacking the enemy if that was necessary. It was truly a pilot's airplane from the standpoint of maneuverability. In the standpoint, it was a great gun platform. It had nice stable wings. And it had a steel tube fuselage which protected the pilot in case of a crash. The Fokker D-7 was a good airplane because the man who designed it was Tony Fokker. He was 26 years of age. He was the same age as the fighter pilots. He had incredible rapport with the fighter pilots, so the fighter pilots could tell them what they wanted. And he would go to the front or he'd talk to them and he'd find out, what do we want in an airplane?
Peter Kilduff, a World War I aviation historian.
I would take the example of Karl Degelow, commanding officer of Jagdstaffel 40, who performed the rare feat of capturing an airplane in the air. And he did that by virtue of the fact that the Fokker D-7 was so responsive and so quick in everything it had to do. He was in a fight with a 2-seat British fighter plane, a Bristol fighter, and by pulling back on the controls, he got the observer to expend all of his ammunition. So he just pulled in, waggled his wings ever so slightly, so that the crew of the 2-seater knew that if they tried anything, Degelow would shoot them down in a heartbeat. But they just went down slower and slower. Finally, the 2-seater landed. Degelow circled around once. He landed, got out of the airplane, came over and said, "Good day, you are English, you are my prisoner."
The Fokker D-7, from a pilot's perspective, from what we know, from the many pilots I've talked with, from literature, and the Germans and the British, of course, filed combat reports. One, it was easy to fly. It was not a handful of airplanes. You could probably fly it stick off, and it would maintain a level attitude. On the other hand, by virtue of the way it was designed, it was maneuverable enough to tangle with any Allied airplane. And I think every airplane, to be really successful with a pilot, in my opinion, it has to give the pilot confidence that this is the safest vehicle that he's up in the air with.
1926 through 1942 represents the next major era of airplane developments. The evolution from the wood and fabric creations of the first wartime era to sleeker, low-wing airplanes, often incorporating metal structures. Germany first put its airplanes from this era to the wartime test, assisting Franco in the Civil War in Spain. In the U.S., developments were spurred by barnstorming pilots, record setters like Lindbergh, and the evolving business of air transport. Nominees for the best fighter during this period are the Messerschmitt Bf-109, Designed in 1934, it dominated Europe for Germany through the summer of 1940 until finally pitted against newer British fighters. The Hawker Hurricane. It was the Royal Air Force's first modern fighter with closed cockpit, retractable landing gear, 8 guns, and 300-mile-an-hour speed. The Supermarine Spitfire. It evolved from a line of high-speed seaplane racers and became the symbol of Britain's will to fight back against almost impossible odds. The Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. Distinctive with its gnarling shark teeth, the P-40 in the hands of the Flying Tigers and other Army pilots held the Japanese at bay in the early months of the war. The Mitsubishi A6M Reisen. This is the infamous Zero, Japan's most produced and used fighter that was in service for Japan from 1940 to the end of the war. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat. With a strong record of kills in the Pacific, this was the first monoplane carrier-based fighter, which in 1941 replaced obsolete biplanes from the carrier decks. The winner, Britain's Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire wasn't the fastest fighter, nor did it carry excessive fuel, but its wide wings gave it strong turn and climb performance. And the reliable Rolls-Royce Merlin III engine that was already proven in the Hurricane powered the new Spitfires as well. And it was well armed. Early versions carried 8 Browning machine guns. Hurricanes, along with Spitfires, were the primary defenders of Britain against 109s escorting invading German bombers during the Battle of Britain. Gunther Roll flew 109s on the Russian front, then in the Battle of Britain, and for 5 more years of the war, and was the number 3 ace in the world with 275 enemy kills.
I was very familiar with the 109, knowing the disadvantages also in the flight envelope versus the Spitfire, for instance. A Spitfire climbed in a tight turn much better than a 109 did. So you should know in which area of the flight envelope you are superior to the other one. And there are few, only few. But we had very good ammunition, we had very good weaponry aboard the aircraft. We had the 20mm gun, we had the 15mm gun, very effective.
Peter Townsend, Royal Air Force Group Commander.
And I told my boys, or the pilots in my squadron, if you get a Messerschmitt on your tail, turn and turn and turn. Don't dive, don't climb, otherwise he'll get you. And it did happen that you would keep turning. If he stayed with you, maybe in a couple of turns you would get in behind him. And too bad for him.
An American, Jim Goodson, flew 200 missions and had 32 kills. He first flew Spitfires with the Royal Air Force in 1940.
Well, in the early days of the war, it was mostly scrambling to go up and try and stop the German bombers coming over. In the days I was flying the Spitfire, and the Spitfire itself was really a defensive airplane. And so we'd be sitting in the thing and waiting to be scrambled. They'd shoot off a flare and we'd scramble when the German planes were coming over to bomb England. And so most of our missions were very short. The Spitfire itself had a very short range.
Herbert Knobel, a German HE-111 bomber pilot during the Battle of Britain.
And one thing I recall, the English fighter pilots, the Spitfires, they were absolutely fantastic. They came from above and straight down onto the formation and picked somebody and shoot them to pieces, and then they turned around and dove into the underneath the bombers just at the time when we released the bombs. Naturally, no fighter was following him, you know, because they had the perfect protection. That's the way they came back. But it was, when I saw this, it was absolutely unbelievable the way they did it, the way they came down. It was great, you know. I mean, I didn't feel so great at the time, but later on, you know, when you think about the way they did it, was just fantastic.
Every pilot fell in love with the Spit. It was a pilot's airplane. And it was so maneuverable, very light to the touch. You moved your stick a half an inch and you were in a slow roll. That was what it was like to fly a Spitfire. You became part of the plane. And when you were looking around, you were constantly turning the plane around rather than your head. We were delighted to get Spitfires because it was faster, could outturn the Hurricane, and it was a delight to fly. It was like pulling on a tight pair of pants. You became part of the airplane, and everybody that flew the Spit had a love affair with it. They just loved it.
The 4 years, 1943 through 1946, was the most astounding period ever in airplane development. There was a war to be won, and it was being fought in the air as much as anywhere else. Design and construction came at a feverish pitch from nations on all sides. A new crop of airplanes came to the front with fighting ranges 3 times greater than those of fighters at the beginning of World War II. The new models took giant strides as well in climb, agility, and firepower over those developed before the war. The nominees for top fighters from this era are the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. A creation of Kelly Johnson's team at Lockheed, it offered the safety of a second engine and was the fighter flown by Richard Bong, America's #1 ace. The Vought 4 FU Corsair. It was the first Navy fighter to be able to top 400 miles per hour. Its kill ratio record by war's end was 11 kills for every F-4U lost. The Focke-Wulf FW-190. It proved to be Germany's most potent piston-powered fighter, the first with a clear canopy and a speedy, maneuverable threat that matched any Allied opposition. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat. It entered the war in 1943, and in 2 years, its pilots had destroyed almost 5,200 enemy aircraft, 75% of the Navy's combat kills during the period. The North American P-51 Mustang. Early Allison engine models were only modest successes, but with a Rolls-Royce engine and extra fuel, it got what it needed. And the Messerschmitt Me-262. This was the first operational jet with a top speed of 540 miles an hour, and when its engines worked, it totally outflew any piston engine fighter. The winner, the P-51 Mustang. But it was not the first version of the airplane with its Allison engine that gave the airplane its claim to greatness. Those early models designed to British specifications were used as tactical fighters, reconnaissance airplanes, and dive bombers. But several modifications made it the best American fighter of World War II. The addition of a bubble canopy to improve pilot tracking and targeting of his adversary, and more power in the form of a Rolls-Royce Merlin supercharged V12 engine and more fuel to run it. The P-51 had 6 50-caliber machine guns. James Brooks, a P-51 ace who escorted bombers into the heart of Germany.
The feel of this airplane gave you a great deal of confidence. You felt like you were in control. The roll rate of the airplane was fast, so when you wanted to maneuver right or left, that happened very fast. But I'm saying that the controls were very responsive. Not only at low altitudes, but at high altitudes also. It was remarkable that it would perform so well at those high altitudes.
During the war, as the Germans advanced, flight distances and time in the air became more and more a factor for Allied aircraft. The Mustang had to escort the bombers to the heart of Germany and still have fuel to fight and return to its base in England or Italy.
The great distances that we had to fly before we even got close to engaging the enemy. Get up to 5:30, briefing at 6, breakfast 6:30, go back and say your prayers, or go to the bathroom or whatever, then you go to the aerodrome, which was 30 minutes away. Now it's 8 o'clock. 3 squadrons take off, you rendezvous, and you start into Germany. These guys haven't gotten up. But I certainly wouldn't want to be in that position, but still. This Mustang was doing it for you. It was doing all the work, you see, and it would take you there and bring you back if you were smart enough to get back. unbelievable.
One of those P-51 pilots dodging clouds and downing Messerschmitts over Europe was Bob Goebel, then a 21-year-old second lieutenant.
So we would keep our speed up, running on our drop tanks, and scissor across the top, watching that no enemy fighters formed up. Now we'd see contrails sometimes up very high, but maybe they would pass us up, or they'd come down. Now sometimes if they'd come down, they'd get a first pass in. You couldn't stop them from making a first pass if they came down from altitude, but we'd engage them then and drive them off or do whatever we could to keep the bombers safe.
Well, the war would have lasted a lot longer if it hadn't been for the Mustang to have the capability to escort the heavy bombers deep into Germany. No question that it contributed so much to that.
And there have been some very nice airplanes over the period that you described. It'd be very difficult for me to pick one, but if I had to, I would have picked the P-51 Mustang because I had such good success with it and felt as keenly and as personally toward it as I do. But I'd like to think that objectively that's a good choice. That's a proper choice. But I firmly believe that the P-51 Mustang was a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence, and was indeed the best fighter that came along in its day, in its own day, had the greatest impact, and was the best machine around.
The next era, 1947 through 1960, encompassed the Korean War. And in every wartime encounter after World War II, pilots in jet-powered fighters would duel for control of the skies. The Me-262 set the tone for many that followed as jet designs evolved and improved rapidly. They often featured swept wings, leading-edge slats for better slow speed control, and a flying tail for added maneuverability. Two of the main combatants in the Korean War are nominees for Best of the Era. The North American F-86 Saber. It was easy to fly, reliable, and featured an advanced radar-ranging gun sight for rapid targeting of the adversary. The Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-15. It evolved from captured German design information, and its effectiveness was due in part to Rolls-Royce jet engines sold by Britain to the Russians in 1947. And Britain's Hawker Hunter, introduced early in the 1950s, it quickly was recognized as a fine, all-around fighter of its decade and remains in service to some nations today. The winner, the F-86 Saber. MiG-15s and F-86s tangled over Korea in a more complex and high-speed repeat of the battles between Spitfires and Messerschmitt 109s during the Battle of Britain. The Soviet MiG outgunned the early F-86s, and the MiG-15 was more maneuverable at high altitude, but at lower levels, the Saber had the edge, particularly in roll rate. It had more advanced gun sights than the MiG, and the Saber also had better climate control systems in the cockpit, so it could dive rapidly without fogging up the canopy. A distinct advantage put to use by Boots Bisset, who had flown P-51s after World War II and later flew F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam.
The airplanes were good. There were things we could do that the MiG couldn't do. The MiG rolled over at 35,000 feet and went straight down. And you knew darn well you were going to be able to get him because as he went down, his pressurization system was very poor, and it iced up, and by the time he got to probably 25,000 feet, he couldn't see out of the airplane. He's on instruments. And he had to get down and get to lower altitude, roll it out, and then very gradually let the warm air in the cockpit take the frost off his canopy. So that was a real boon. If you could, if you get up there and get behind him and make him dive, you had a real advantage over him.
John Glenn, a U.S. Senator and in 1962 the first American to orbit the Earth, honed his combat skills during 100 missions as an F-86 pilot over Korea.
The ability to dive at high speed, it was the first of our fighters really that was a supersonic fighter. You couldn't go supersonic in level flight with it, but you could roll over and go supersonic going down on a dive. And so that was the first of our airplanes that you could really do that with.
The F-86's controls, its ailerons for turn and elevators for climb and descent were hydraulically boosted, which gave it superior roll and pitch control. But it was essentially a simple, easy-to-fly airplane.
It was a light flying airplane, very responsive, and you could wrap it up, pull hard into it, and you never needed to worry about pulling anything off of that airplane. It was very ruggedly built.